Okay.
Okay.
Yay.
Good morning, everybody. Steph and I just finished one of our studio sessions, and so let me begin by giving you the writing prompt that we began with and then continued to work in our journals with. The writing prompt is, when do I feel most generous?
I gotta hop right in, Sarah, and say I appreciate that one because I realize it's pretty loaded for me, you know? Like
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm most generous when all of my needs are met, which in some ways makes sense. Like if I'm in pain or I'm starving or, I have a low blood sugar or something like that, I'm not going to be as generous, obviously.
Right.
But let's see, what did I write? Oh, the other thing that came up, which was interesting, was that I'm most generous when I'm seen and heard and respected.
Mm-hmm.
Which again is another way of being met and fed. But it was just surprising. Like if I'm not, if I guess things need to be flowing. It's that whole reciprocity thing that we talk about. Anyway,
Well,
yeah.
and that's what I found when I wrote too, is I thought, wow, my generosity is conditional. It's not like I'm more generous when when I get my needs met, I'll give you more. And so that's an interesting place for me, that I think a lot of my generosity has been fueled by sort of giving to get.
Mm-hmm.
And what would it mean what would it be like to be more generous with others, with myself? Am I also generous with myself? It's sort of a giving to get. I can be generous with myself if if all my ducks in a row and I'm taking care of myself and I feel good.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as I get knocked off balance, it's like everything just sort of closes down. And I don't have anything to give to myself, to anybody else. And then I resent the giving.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does it mean to be generous from that open-hearted place? It doesn't have the giving to get, but because I moved to give.
Right. And I feel most moved to give when I have the most juice, like when I'm juiced up, when I have fed myself, mentally, physically, spiritually, all of that. It's that whole thing, where you have to take care of yourself first before you take care of others, because otherwise it's not going to work out. And there's this whole misnomer I think I've led my whole life on, or, a lot of it, which is give first, be generous to a fault. Don't even, do it without anything, any needs or any expectations. And yes, that's good to a point, but you can't sustain yourself that way.
Right, because I think that's the kind of generosity that's always going, for me, I'm always giving it out to others. And I don't count, I don't put myself in the generosity line.
Right.
And begin there. Because of some of the conversation we had earlier, I thought, when do I feel most generous? after I get done feeling snarky and put upon and have had a few days to stew in my own shitty fuck you juices. And there is a truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
I like the generosity I feel after I have a studio session that's gone well, or a cranial session with Denise, and I feel open and, oh, I can, be so generous. But on that day-to-day basis, if I reach this, sometimes I hit a point if I'm being asked to be generous in my response to something or my giving to something, and it hits me the wrong way. And maybe it's generosity to own the fact that first I've got to feel snarky, and then I have to feel put upon. And then what's generous is I give myself the time to do that. To me, what's really up, I'm feeling put upon. And not to lash out with it, but to, like what we talk about is to let it be in the crucible of our, that inner, let's burn it up. And then as I, and you said that this morning as we were talking, is, can I give myself a few days just to let things settle before I make a choice, instead of making choices to be generous that are ungenerous to myself.
Oh, well said.
That's really really the piece is how do we all do that? Because I think when we come from that place, when I've been generous with myself, I can find a way through. It may still be uncomfortable. There still may be a little bit of tension, but when my first response is to be generous with myself with what I'm feeling, then I find a place where I can be there without the I can be generous without the reactivity and the expectations of getting something, or that, it's some kind of earned thing.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought I'd be talking about chaos this morning.
Well, it's interesting because I wrote quite a bit about the generosity piece, and how I've lived over half of my life one way, and working towards a more holistic way the last few years. But then as I started working, I something completely different came in, which is wonderful, because it's like, okay, well, that's been taken care of. That's done. And now I can move on. There's room for something else to arrive. And it did. And that was just as rich. I just love this.
Yeah, it's, it was interesting when I was working with the prompt for this morning. I kept thinking, because this thing about meeting chaos, which has been going on a lot in my journal, is how I want to clean it all up first before I can move ahead. And I kept thinking that was the main thing, but there was some stuff that happened yesterday that that when I went to bed, I thought, no, this is about generosity, being generous. And what is being generous? The thing that fascinates me about this process is, as you know, I worked all the way through a journal, and now I'm working backwards, and it's so rich because there's different layers that are more accessible to me than when I paint. And I really, it's a way of being generous with myself to really be digging the accessibility. But it occurred to me as I was working in the journal that I've worked backwards to a place that the writing prompt was, and this was 6 months ago. Let's see, what do I need to let go of to be more open to what is actually unfolding?
Oh, that's so crazy because that's what I ended up sort of making my way to while I was working. And it's more about what the images and stuff.
Mhm.
That's crazy. That's awesome.
Yeah. And I hadn't really noticed that, when the writing prompt came up for me and I was writing, and then I start working and I'm going, oh, this is so bizarre to have this prompt have been the groundwork for the page I'm now working on with the prompt that is, when do I feel the most generous? And then when I read, because I write sometimes in my journal, and I did on this page, and then when I read that part, I think, the first sentence is, I can let go of thinking there is a place I'm going to finally arrive at.
Mm.
And it's like letting go of expectations, the giving to get. And I do think one of the things I like about the writing is, it does feel like sometimes I'm repeating the same theme over and over again. But in that 3-minute just writing and being really honest, like I have to really get snarky first before I can be generous, something does shift. It may come back, and it's like the journal, I've worked through it and now I'm back. And then here's this page that's sort of right where I was 6 months ago, but it's a deeper layer that I can move into and be, not try to not try to reconnect to where I was 6 months ago, but to be just right where I'm at right now. And then it all begins to work together.
Exactly. That's why I like the writing too, because it's also a mile marker for me. Like I'm able to see how far I've come, even if I hadn't have written something, and come back to that place where inevitably there's a cyclical thing. It's a spiral. It goes deeper and deeper. So there is work that's being done, but had I not written about it, then I might think I'm still in the same place. You know what I mean? So
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, this is, wow. Incredible.
Yeah. So let's be generous with ourselves and not prolong this conversation.
Yeah, totally. And hope that if you're watching, you're doing some work in your journal while you're listening, or you're just soaking it up, however it works for you. But yeah, thank you again for listening.
Yeah, and take some time to write about when you feel the most generous.
Yeah.
It's quite potent. So, all right. Goodbye, Steph. Goodbye, ladies.
Bye,
and see ya in the next month.
Yeah. Bye, guys.